This time on the Discover the Word podcast, Elisa Morgan takes the group to a familiar statement of Jesus recorded in the Gospel of John. It's when Jesus said, "I have come that they might have life and have it to the full." Some translations use the word abundant, live an abundant life. And you hear that, and your thoughts go to a bigger house, a more expensive car, amazing vacations, and generally more money and stuff than you know what to do with. You live that way, and that is a full, abundant, prosperous life. But is that what Jesus was promising when he said, "I am come that they might have life and that they might have it abundantly to the full"? Seems like he said a lot of other things that tell us that wealth and prestige and position and power in this world were not his priorities. I mean, if that were the case, he would have lived a very different kind of life, don't you think? And so what did Jesus mean when he talked about why he came? Well, join Elisa and Bill Crowder and Daniel Ryan Day and Rasul Berry here on Discover the Word for a study based in the Gospel of John that will shed some light on living life to the full. And it is time we get the Discover the Word group together. Discover the Word is Bible engagement for life from Our Daily Bread Ministries. And we use a group approach to explore topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and point us to discover Jesus, the living Word of God, in the pages of the written Word of God. And so in this episode of the podcast, Elisa and Bill and Daniel and Rasul are your study partners who invite you to pull a chair up to the table with them to explore what these famous words of Jesus mean. What does it mean to live life to the full? Isn't full a bit much to expect when reality has so much pain and brokenness in it as well? Well, I hope you're going to find this to be a helpful and encouraging study that we do together. So let's get another edition of the Discover the Word podcast started and listen as Elisa begins with this question.
Guys, what does the word full, F-U-L-L, mean to you? What comes to mind?
I'm glad you spelled it out because F-O-O-L is what came to mind initially.
It all depends on our dialect and our accent, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, I tell you, Elisa, to me, the word full means enough. Or sometimes it could even mean more than enough. Like if you've had a big meal and you say, "I'm full," that probably means I ate too much.
Yeah.
But I had more than enough. So to me, in the very least, to be full means to have enough.
That's really a great definition. Thanksgiving and more. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true, Bill, because when we have a meal and we've eaten just enough, we'll say something like that. "Oh, I had just enough," or "I'm satisfied," or something like that. Usually when we use the word full, it means we've had a little bit too much to eat.
That's right.
And we're ready just to loosen the old belt and lay down on the couch for a while. So
A little bit of a taut tummy, yeah.
Yeah, I think about like my heart is full, you know, and this idea there could just be these moments that you have in life. I think about my wedding day where it's just like my heart is full. I am feeling a sense of satisfaction is not enough. It's contentment, it's joy. It's almost bursting, but in a good way, not like Thanksgiving bursting, but like, you know, with just a sense of enthusiasm and joy.
Yeah, oh, I love that. Well, I'm bringing it up because that's the question I want us to look at in this series of conversations called Life to the Full. What does that mean? What does the word full mean? And more specifically, what does Jesus mean? In John chapter 10, verse 10, where he says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Some translations say abundant life, which is another word to describe this concept of fullness. And as I live, I don't know about you, but sometimes I go, full of what? You know, full of the good, full of the a little bit too much, or full of the everything The good and the bad, the stress and the relax, the challenge and the provision. What does Jesus mean in this passage? And so to understand that, we need to look at the context to begin with. And let's unpack that now. We often take the words of Jesus out of context and have them on a plaque or on a crocheted, doily or something, or stamped on a refrigerator magnet. But how does our understanding of this context inform us when Jesus is moving from John chapter 9 into John chapter 10? So what happened in John 9, Bill?
Well, John 9 is kind of the I am the light of the world chapter. In John's gospel, Jesus makes a series of I am claims, and then in most of those cases, he does something to back that up. So he heals the man born blind as evidence that he is the light of the world. And then the rest of the chapter is largely about how different people react to him being healed by Jesus. You have the neighbors, some who say, well, he looks like him, but it can't be him because he's supposed to be blind. And he said, no, it's me. And then you have the religious leaders, and they're trying to sort all this out because they don't want to do anything that will give any credibility to Jesus. And then you have the man's parents, which is a tragic case. This should have been something they celebrated more than anything in their whole lives.
You'd
but
think, right.
They're afraid to say anything about it because they don't want to be excommunicated from the synagogue. And then when the man himself says a word that's positive about Jesus, he himself kind of gets excommunicated from the synagogue. And so he's now out there on his own. And that sets the stage for what we see in chapter 10, because he is one of those kind of lost sheep now, that blind man who's not blind anymore. And so now Jesus is going to shepherd him and talk about what that looks like.
And there's a contrast between how Jesus is going to shepherd and how the Pharisees, the
Correct.
leaders of Israel, have been shepherding.
Yeah. The other thing I think that really jumps out to me, Elisa, as you read that verse first and then Bill gave the context, is often when we hear that verse described of life to the full, we kind of missell it to people as if everything in your life's going to go really well.
Right.
But in that context, the man loses access to his community because he gets kicked out of the synagogue. He ends up by himself. He's experienced this amazing healing, which I think is connected to that idea of life to the full. But it doesn't mean everything in your life's going to go well, that everything gets fixed, that just be ready to celebrate because Jesus means happiness and joy and nothing else. Like, this guy gets kicked out of his community, and that is the context for follow me and you'll experience life to the full.
That's so good, Daniel, because that's exactly how Jesus then leads the listeners into this story of this parable of him as a good shepherd. Palestinian sheep farming metaphors, were very common. And comparing a king or a priest to a shepherd and people to sheep was very common in the Middle East. And so Jesus then in John 10 moves from this discourse with the blind man about the blind man and the Pharisees into this a little bit complicated parable. Daniel, give us some background, and Rasul, pipe in. Actually, Rasul, take a peek at Ezekiel 34 while Daniel's explaining this. Daniel, explain to us, what are parables? How did Jesus use them? Give us the basic points there so we have that in the back of our mind as we're looking at this parable.
Yeah, the idea of parables are basically, the best way to think of them is differentiating them from an Aesop's fable. So an Aesop's fable is like, don't give in to flattery. It comes down to this perfect message at the end. Don't give in to flattery, or you'll go to sing, lose the pastry out of your mouth, and the fox will eat it, or depending on which version of the story or whatever. And parables definitely are not about one point typically. There are a couple that Jesus kind of summarizes with a point, but parables typically are not about just this one idea. Also, parables are these immersive stories that they invite you into the story, and then by seeing yourself in this story, by experiencing the story, you begin to see God differently, the world differently, one another differently, yourself differently. And so it's important not to try to make every single piece of the parable mean something, like an allegory or something like that, but to simply be immersed with the story and see kind of how it leads you, where it leads as the story goes. And so for these, especially because Jesus kind of almost mixes metaphors with the different parables here.
Very confusing, yeah.
It could be
Yeah.
even more confusing, but the idea is just sit in each story as we get to it and see how that shapes us.
That's so helpful. And so this parable is mainly about a shepherd and sheep. And I love that you use the word immerse and experience, because that's where we want to go as we dig into experiencing Jesus as a shepherd. How do we live life to the full? It's going to be in that relationship as a sheep to the shepherd. And we're going to look at that in our future conversations. Before we go there, and before we sum up this one, Rasul and Bill too, help us understand how historically God has expressed himself as shepherd, how God has already dealt with leaders of Israel as not doing a good job in their shepherding responsibilities from the Old Testament. And Ezekiel 34, we have a great discourse about it. Jeremiah 23, we do. Maybe net out, what are a couple of points that we learn that Jesus is really echoing here as he starts to talk about the good shepherd?
It really is a very foundational metaphor and picture of both leadership in the people and even God in his people. And you see that in Ezekiel 34, where it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel." And when it's talking about that, it's not just referring to physical shepherds who shepherd sheep. It's talking about the leaders of Israel in that point. But it uses the same word pictures, just as Daniel was talking about, to talk about how they don't care for their sheep. They don't care for the people like a neglectful shepherd of sheep would, just if they were to just let the sheep be sick and harmed or even mistreat them. And then conversely, it's interesting because in the 7th and 8th verses of Ezekiel 34, it says, "Therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd." So there, God is now introducing himself into the story as the ultimate shepherd that actually cares rightly for his sheep.
Yeah, you see that idea again in Jeremiah 23, as you mentioned, Elisa, where God himself speaks through Jeremiah and says, "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture." And that leadership metaphor of shepherds, sometimes it refers to the religious leadership, sometimes it refers to bad kings. And if you read Kings and Chronicles, you know there were plenty of bad kings in
One
both the
after
northern
another,
and southern kingdom. And those are the shepherds that God is crying out against through the prophet.
Yeah, and over again, God will describe a king as one who did right in the eyes of God versus one who did not do what was right in the eyes of God. And it's a wonderful statement to make in this context of the Pharisees who were heaping on all these expectations, as we saw in the story of the blind man, and all focused on the legalism. You know, Jesus is saying, bottom line, God is the ultimate shepherd, echoing Psalm 23, Psalm 80, Isaiah 40. And contrast this life of narrowness, of having to be freaking out about keeping the law perfectly, to living a life of security because the shepherd is the one who provides life to the full for his sheep. So as we go forward and consider this, what does it mean to have life to the full? I think the first thing is to understand that a fullness does contain everything. As we put it together, the abundance of all the good, the emotion, the satisfaction, the needs provided, and also all the bad, but a means to survive the bad by the provision of the shepherd. He is going to provide for us, his sheep, even in those difficult times, walking through the valley of the shadow of death with us, his rod and his staff comforting us. We're going to experience life to the full when we experience or immerse ourselves in 3 postures, and that's what we're going to cover in our next conversations.
Elisa Morgan leading off our study of John chapter 10 and the surrounding context, and Jesus' statement about coming so that his followers might experience life to the full. And so now in this next segment, we're going to build on what we talked about there and look at the first of the 3 postures we can observe here in this passage that will contribute to that living life to the full being our reality. And understanding that sheep They're a key part of understanding what Jesus was saying. And so why do we have to know something about sheep to know what Jesus was saying? Well, let's begin to unpack that in this next part of the conversation.
What do you know about sheep? I mean, with the exception of Daniel, I'm not sure many of us are big, farmy people, but Daniel, you're kind of farmy-ish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really fun. My son raised sheep for a while, and so much of the biblical story started coming into context. They really do learn to hear a particular voice or particular sound. When my son would come out and just the door would close, you'd hear them start bleating because they knew that he was going to feed them.
Dinner, yeah.
And yeah, it was so fun.
That's awesome.
One of the things that fascinates me about sheep is they don't have defenses. I mean, when I think about goats, they seem to have more of an aggressive streak in them.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't know if that's just personality or is it also they're anatomically different. I don't know.
That's an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the word I would use is helpless. They're largely helpless.
Philip Keller, and a shepherd looks at the 23rd Psalm. I believe he was Australian. He would talk about a cast sheep. When he would fall over onto his back, he couldn't get back up without help. It was such an amazing and vivid picture of dependency. An unshorn, domesticated sheep can drag pounds and pounds and pounds of wool around. And, unless it's shorn, it's basically trapped in its own skin, okay? And a sheep can panic when it's separated from the flock, especially in biblical times. All of the references to sheep that we see in Scripture have in mind this kind of needy dependency about it. Let's read John chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Just go around and do that as we consider this parable where Jesus talks about life to the full and what it means, and he uses the idea of shepherds and sheep to explain himself. Daniel, would you start us?
Mm-hmm. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep.
The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice.
But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them.
So in our last conversation, we talked about the Pharisees being not such great shepherds over the people of Israel. And so Jesus is very clearly trying to contrast a good shepherd with a not so great shepherd. And we talked about how we can experience life to the full, what Jesus came to provide for us, when we immerse ourselves in this parable Jesus is telling and experience three different postures. And the first one is the one we just read, and it's the posture of a relationship, that we need to take the role of a sheep and recognize our shepherd. So let's think back to New Testament times. What would the setup be for sheep in a family's home, in a family's living area?
Yeah, it kind of depends on how big the flock is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a smaller flock and there's just a few sheep in there, then they may have a pen even at their house that included the front room of the house.
Yes, even inside.
Yeah, where the manger would be, where they would eat. And then some of the bigger flocks would often get mixed into a gated area in the central part of town. And then someone would spend the night usually laying in front of the entrance to the gated area to kind of protect the sheep. And so that's kind of the metaphor that Jesus is pulling on here. When a shepherd would come to get their sheep, they would blow a whistle or make a sound or something to let the sheep know that they were there. And that particular shepherd, their sheep would know their voice and they'd follow. And then another shepherd would come and get his sheep out of the gate, and then they'd all go up on the mountains or whatever.
And have their day.
And I think it's really helpful, for me at least, to remind myself that even though the imagery you just described, Daniel, is very foreign to me, it was right there at hand for the people that Jesus was talking to.
Oh, yeah.
And so everyone that he was talking to would have been nodding to each other and saying, yeah, that's right. That's exactly the way it is, you know. The ability of the people to relate to what he was saying, I think, is really a key part of that.
I think about the level of intimacy that you just described in terms of there's this sense in which, I mean, laying down in front of the gate, speaking and even potentially living and having the sheep go in and out of the house. I mean, there's a level of intimacy there that I think is really standing out to me.
So then he goes on and he gives several different pictures of roles of people. The first one is in verse 1, the thief and the robber, and we're going to get to them in a future conversation. But then in verse 2, he says the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. Then in verse 3, he says the gatekeeper opens the gate for him. What do you think this shepherd and gatekeeper, is he talking about two separate people or two roles that the same person occupy? Any ideas
It
there?
sounds like two separate people because you have one of them opening the gate and then the shepherd entering the gate. So it sounds like two different people.
Yeah, and I think it would depend on how big the community was and stuff like that, because sometimes different shepherds would take their turn as the gatekeeper. Oftentimes, kids would be the ones that would be like, hey, you're spending the night outside tonight down at the sheep gate. So I think it could be two different roles, but sometimes a shepherd would also be the gatekeeper as well. But Jesus seems to be really describing two different roles here because he wants to draw attention, or at least it seems like it, to the voice of the shepherd and the fact that this shepherd is recognized by both the gatekeeper and by the sheep as he comes to the gate to pick up the sheep.
And he's really metaphorizing himself. You know, he is the good shepherd. And we are the sheep. You know, down in verse 16, Rasul, what do you see down in verse 16? We'll get to it in another conversation, but I wanted to just jump there for a second. Could you read that?
I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd.
So, you know, it's growing, you know, and we can read that now and understand that not only will Jews be a part of God's kingdom, but that Gentiles will also be included, that other people not from this flock will be brought in and included in that. We are sheep. And how does that make sense for us today? This is our first posture to embrace as we immerse ourselves in this parable to understand, what does this mean for me? How do I experience life to the full? I take the role of a sheep, and I recognize the voice of my shepherd.
Yeah, Elisa, you started off the conversation with the word relationship. And the thing that I find really interesting is much of the time in the Psalms where God is described, he's described using kind of inanimate objects. The Lord is a rock or a tower or a fortress or a shield or a sword. But Psalm 23 makes it very personal. The Lord is my shepherd. And that speaks of a relationship, not just something, but someone. And it really takes it to a different level, I think.
Yes, as Rasul reflected, yes, that this is a very intimate, physical, 24/7, in your own home, as Daniel helped us understand. This is a relationship. In fact, let's close this conversation by reading Psalm 23. Let's just go around. So I'm going to ask you to start and listen to, take the role of the sheep as you're listening to these words, understanding that Jesus, God, is our shepherd, and this is what he provides for us as sheep. This is what he wants to give us in order that we have life to the full.
The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures.
He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows.
Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
My cup overflows.
That sounds full.
It sounds full. Goodness and mercy and love follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It all sounds full. Life to the full.
Yeah, that first posture that we observe is one where we recognize that we are sheep, and the Lord is my shepherd. And life to the full is life lived in relationship with the Lord as our shepherd. That relationship, not our circumstances, that relationship is the key to understanding what Jesus meant when he said that he came to bring life, and that we might have it abundantly to the full. So, as we're discovering, understanding sheep and shepherding is a crucial part of this study. And so let's take a break for a word about a really helpful resource from Our Daily Bread Ministries that may throw more light on that subject. Well, it is great to have you as part of the group for this study of John chapter 10. And before we go any further, just want to take a moment to point you to a couple of resources that will fill out even more for you the conversations that we're having. One is a great book that we have called The Good Shepherd, 40 Biblical Insights on Leading and Being Led. It was written by our Senior Vice President of Global Content here at Our Daily Bread Ministries, Tim Laniak. Now, Tim has extensive experience traveling to biblical lands and sharing them with students and tour groups. And to write this book, Tim spent about a year living with Bedouin shepherds in the Middle East to better understand the biblical metaphor of shepherds and sheep. Here's an excerpt from his introduction to The Good Shepherd, where Tim wrote, "I am indebted to so many Bedouin tribes for taking me into their tents and opening up their worlds to me. Their comments on the everyday world of shepherd work began to shape my understanding of biblical passages in unexpected ways." So I hope you will check out this book. It's called The Good Shepherd by Tim Laniak. We'll have a link to it in our show notes for this episode at discovertheword.org. And then just real quickly, in those show notes, you'll also find a link to a Discover the Word study where Tim Laniak was our guest. We called that episode The Good Shepherd as well. And you'll be fascinated by some of the stories that Tim tells about living with those Bedouin shepherds and the perspective he gained during that year with them. There's a link to that Discover the Word episode with Tim called The Good Shepherd that I think you'd enjoy in the show notes as well, along with the link to Tim's book. It's at discovertheword.org. And so now let's move on to posture and observation number 2 that Elisa will point us to, that comes out of this sheep and shepherding metaphor that Jesus uses to reinforce his statement about coming to bring full and abundant life. And this posture has to do with hearing and listening. Is there a difference? I've heard it said that hearing is through the ears, but listening is through the mind. Because while those two activities do both involve the use of the ears, they can be very different. And often, speaking from personal experience, when I say, sorry, I didn't hear you, I actually should have said, no, sorry, I wasn't listening. Because in order to live this life to the full as sheep, a posture of hearing, and maybe more importantly, listening, really are key. And so let's listen as Elisa begins this segment by asking a question that I have a hard time not jumping in and answering in a kidding kind of way. What?
How's your hearing? Do you have any kind of hearing impairment, or are you still pretty good?
I've got tinnitus.
Oh, Bill, I'm sorry. Explain what it is.
Yeah, it's ringing in your ears, and I got it about 15 years ago. I was flying back from a trip to Asia. I got onto the plane in Tokyo and did not have tinnitus, and I got off the plane in Detroit, and I did. Just in the course of that flight, something happened, and my ears have been ringing ever since.
I'm so sorry. And I know a lot of people struggle with that. How about you two young'uns? You got any issues?
I don't think so. I do. I say it hesitantly because my wife will tell you that
That's
I
humble.
like the TV
Yeah.
on a little bit too loud.
Yeah.
So I try to be careful with my earbuds and my TV watching because I tend to like the volume louder than others. But, so far so good, though.
Yeah.
The last hearing test I had, because Brian and I every once in a while have to have a hearing test for work, working in the audio world.
Awesome.
And the last one was really good. So
Awesome.
I don't think so.
I have a friend who found out the hard way. She was always yelling at her husband, not yelling, but, nudging her husband to get some help because she knew he had a problem. So she said, I'll go if you go. So they went in and she had a hearing problem. So I had mine tested as well because my kids are always like, Mom. And guess what? I have a severe loss. So I have hearing aids. And so I noticed that there were certain frequencies that I could not make out, even with hearing aids. It's like my brother's voice, which was an issue because
Yeah.
I was a caregiver for him. Anyway, it helps us as we read scripture and think about how is our hearing when Jesus is talking about hearing. And so in this conversation, as we continue into what are the postures we take in order to experience what Jesus says we can have in him, which is life to the full. One of the postures he suggests is a relationship of hearing, of attentiveness, listening to the shepherd and following him. So let's read John 10. Let's pick up at verse 2 and go to verse 8. Let's just go around together. You want to start us, Bill?
Okay. John 10, verse 2, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out.
When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice.
Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them.
Just let's stop there and just go back through what we just read together and look for all of the references to listen, to voice, to follow, to hear. Just, Bill, start off with the verses you did. What do you see in verse 2
Well,
and 3?
yeah, the sheep listen to his voice. He calls them by name.
Mm-hmm.
And that same thing continues in verse 4. They follow him because they know his voice. They don't follow the stranger because they don't know his voice. And it's interesting, we're talking about speech, and it says in verse 6, Jesus used a figure of speech, and the Pharisees didn't understand it. So they weren't hearing the shepherd's voice very well, were they?
Good. Excellent. And then verse 8, the sheep didn't listen to the thieves and the robbers. It's interesting. I mean, when we put on our hearing aids, so to speak, and listen to scripture this way, a lot pops off the page. Jesus is the shepherd himself in verse 2. And in verse 3, he calls us to listen to his voice. Likely there were several flocks in one sheep pen, as Daniel shared with us earlier. The shepherd has a unique call for his sheep. And the sheep belong to the shepherd even before he calls them because they've learned that voice. When he's brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. And in verse 3, it says he leads them out. What do we know about how a shepherd moves his sheep? What's the posture there?
Yeah, this is definitely a leading out. So leading from the front, although sometimes shepherds do walk behind and nudge as well, especially if they have an ornery sheep that likes to wander, which that could be a sermon in and of itself.
Sure could.
Sure
could. Been there.
But yeah,
done
there's
that.
a sense in which the shepherd kind of goes out before. It's usually not in the middle of, so it's usually out before or behind. And in this particular case, it seems like Jesus is really describing the going out in front and using his voice to lead because they recognize the sound of that shepherd.
Yeah, and I was thinking of that same contrast in terms of the humility involved with thinking of ourselves as sheep. Like there's a certain posture and eagerness of following the leader that on the one hand is a pretty humble way to live in contrast to a society or a culture that says you be the person that determines your own fate. And this is saying, actually, I'm giving the reins and the leadership to Jesus. The other thing I notice is the stakes of that. Like in this passage, you think about even the danger of a child in a large gathering, a mall or something. And I can remember when, that scary moment where you kind of wander a little bit from mom or dad, and then you are listening for this voice. There's also a real danger in listening to the wrong voice and going home with the wrong person that
Totally.
has ill intent. And I think in that same contrast that Jesus is drawing out, this isn't just like hey, this is a pastoral picture that isn't that quaint. Like, there are real stakes involved if we go down the path of listening to the wrong voices.
Totally. And we're going to go deep into that. So remind us of that, Rasul, in the next conversation. Jesus, as we continue to think about life to the full, in verse 7, he says, again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who've come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I'm the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. Daniel, help us understand. Jesus has talked about himself as a shepherd. He's talked about the gatekeeper. Now he's calling himself the gate. What do we understand about these titles?
Yeah, he kind of gives a spoiler at the beginning because he talks about the gatekeeper's job is to keep the sheep in until the right shepherd comes to lead them out. And so when he now changes to the gate, he's kind of describing himself as the one who is that protective mechanism against those sheep following the wrong person versus following the right person. But it is kind of wonky the way this parable unfolds because it's kind of confusing as to who Jesus is, especially in this passage a few times. But I think that's kind of the crux there, is the idea that he is that gate that protects them from those that would want to harm them and those that are leading them out to good pastures.
I almost think, and it's not perfect again, but it's almost an expression of the Trinity. Of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. We've got the Father who is the shepherd, we've got Jesus who is the one who lays down his life, and we've got the gate, the gatekeeper and the gate. And that discernment of whose voice are we to follow is really the Spirit's role in our lives, the gatekeeper who keeps us and the gate who keeps us there. He goes on in verses 11 and 12 and 14 and 15, and he says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Most shepherds don't really have to do that, and yet that's the posture they assume, isn't it? And Hebrews, actually, chapter 13, verse 20, goes even further to describe Jesus' shepherdness. Rasul, could you grab that and read that?
Sure. Now, may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep.
Jesus is not only the good shepherd, he's the great shepherd. And when he talks about giving us life to the full, it's a relationship of attentiveness with God. Back to verse 14. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. They listen to my voice, they follow me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. The intimacy that Jesus has with his Father is the intimacy we get to have with Jesus and the Father. So how can we attend to the shepherd's voice so we can readily follow, so we can be led? Life to the full is something we experience when we listen to our shepherd's voice, the great shepherd's voice, and we follow where he leads.
And so sometimes it's a hearing problem, but more often it's a listening problem, isn't it? And so another key to living this life to the full that Jesus is talking about is this issue of attentiveness and making sure that we're listening to the shepherd's voice. Well, next, Elisa has a third posture for us to assume, a third observation about what Jesus meant about coming to bring us this full, abundant life. And this third posture has to do with discernment. And it seems like discernment has become a huge issue again in our day. Who do you believe? Who do you trust? Who do you listen to? And discerning that is pretty important. And so let's listen.
Okay, this might be a triggering question, so a gentle moment here. Have you ever experienced a robbery, something being stolen from you, or any kind of theft?
When we were living in Southern California, we had a gated back fence that was locked all the time and so forth, and somebody broke into it while we were at church one night and stole our son's bicycle. which doesn't trigger anything for me, but it really bothered him.
Yeah, I've had a few bikes stolen over time as well. That was my welcome to New York moment when I used a cable lock around the frame, but just kind of cut through it. Somebody did, and learned the valuable lesson of getting a sturdier U-lock around, and you got to tie it to the frame and I think I had tied it around the tire, and they just took everything else as opposed to the frame and whatnot.
Yeah, I was running one of my dad's businesses, and we had some stuff stolen, and there's just there's a vulnerability. You're angry. You want justice, right? You want that person to be held accountable for their actions. It's also super disruptive because it meant that we had to deal with a lot of things the next day instead of just opening for business like we normally would. A lot of other people get involved, like the sheriff's department, police department, those types of things. So it's really disruptive in so many ways. It makes you feel
So
very
hard.
vulnerable.
And stay on the emotional part. Have you ever been robbed emotionally, or in a relationship, or in a situation of serving in ministry? Robbed emotionally, someone abusing your power or abusing their power.
Yeah, I think about the difficulty when someone misrepresents a conflict and essentially steals your name, your credibility,
Yes.
because of representing a situation in a way that wasn't true. And there's a sense of violation that can be felt that way as well. So yeah, I've experienced that.
And I think about when in the past I've worked with people, even hired people who I trusted to have the best in mind for the people they were shepherding, okay? And they didn't make great choices. And so therefore, their abuse hurt others. This is a deep topic, but I wanted us to go to the emotional side of it because I think that is what Jesus is trying to get at as we continue this conversation of what does it mean to live life to the full. And we've talked about that there are these, as he describes in this parable of the shepherd and the sheep, himself the shepherd, us the sheep, that there are these postures we take in order to experience life to the full. One is recognizing that we're sheep and following our shepherd. And the second one is having a relationship where we're attentive to his voice and we follow after him. But then there's another one where we have just an awareness that, yikes, we're in a situation of potential danger and we need attentiveness with discernment. Where might there be a false shepherd or somebody who's out for our bad rather than our good? And so to focus in on that element, it's almost like a filter we need to put in place, a protection we need to put in place so that we don't fall victim and miss God and follow after something that's not God. Let's look at John 10, verse 1. Bill, could you get that? Verse 10, Russell, could you get that? And then verses 12 to 14. Daniel, please.
Okay, John chapter 10, verse 1. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber.
Okay, let's talk about thief and the robbers just for a minute here. Thief conveys a secret, crafty embezzlement. So it's got that element to it. Robbery is a different word, and it also connotes violence. Thief is stealing without somebody's knowledge, and robbery also includes the bonking them over the head or, taking violence in the path. Okay, and then if we go on, the next verse.
The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full.
Okay, there's a real difference and a contrast between the motivation. What's the thief's motive?
To take.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Good way to summarize it. Whereas I, Jesus, the shepherd, who enters the appropriate way, has come to
Give.
Yeah. Okay, then Daniel, verses 12 to 14.
The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me.
There are a couple of bad guys in this section. Who do you see there, Daniel?
Yeah, well, and I don't know that they mean to be a bad guy. Right, they're a hired hand who doesn't own the sheep, but is out there because this must be a pretty good sized flock or the shepherd needs help. And so he's hired somebody to do it. But when the wolf comes and it scares that hired hand, he runs away to protect his own life. And then you have the wolf, who is the one that is actually coming to do just like the thief and steal, kill, and destroy.
Very good. And it's a self-check, a self-examination for us as we enter into responsibilities in our world, different roles. Are we just skating like a hired hand, or have we invested as a shepherd? What has God called us to? What has God called others to? The wolf is this crazy other thing. It's this invader that comes from the outside that's completely unpredictable, that we seemingly don't have any control over. I think it's interesting to look at verse 2 when you think about the presence of a wolf. So read verse 2 for us, would you?
Sure. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep.
Okay. And then Jesus later on calls himself the gate. It's verse 7. I am the gate. All who've come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened. I'm the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. It's not only do we have to be afraid of thieves and robbers, we need to be aware that Jesus himself, through the Holy Spirit, provides a gate of protection for us to discern who should come in and out of our lives. That's so helpful to me. We need to be in a relationship of attentiveness, connected to the gate, letting everything come through Jesus in and out of our lives so that we're aware of thieves and robbers, hired hands and wolves. In John chapter 3, John the Baptist describes himself with a different metaphor, but I think it hints at this same role of the Holy Spirit. Rasul, could you grab John chapter 3, I think it's around verse 29, and read that for us?
You got it. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete.
So John was attending as the first man, if you will, the groom who was coming, and he was helping the bride of Christ, the church, understand and recognize the voice of the one coming. Similarly, Jesus as the gate serves as our discerning, our relationship with Jesus serves as our discerning offering so that we are aware of the thieves that keep us from experiencing the full life. In our day and age, what kinds of thieves want to come in and steal and kill and destroy and rob us of life to the full?
I almost think there's a little bit of a distinction here too, because you have the thief and the bandit are doing something wrong. The wolf is just being the wolf. And the shepherd has this discernment of knowing when there's a threat from just the way life goes sometimes versus a threat by people that are intentionally here to do something wrong.
That's good.
So I almost feel like there's two different warnings within it of those who really are out for themselves or who are corrupt or who are trying to deceive or whatever. And then just the everyday dangers of life as well. And kind of that desire for our shepherd to be the one that protects us and helps us see both of those.
We live in an imperfect world. You're right. There are going to be people who directly desire our demise, who are out to get us. And then there is just the evil in a human's heart that can rule, and we may not even smell it out. And our own struggles with our own imperfections, whether it's something like an addiction or something like a confusing upbringing that left us with deep misunderstandings of where we find love. These things threaten to steal and kill and destroy us. And when we are called into a life that is full, it's called into a relationship where Jesus himself serves as our gate, as the gatekeeper, to protect us and to give us defense against those things that would steal from us.
Yeah, part of this metaphor using sheep and shepherds that Jesus used includes this discernment aspect and being aware of who we're listening to. Not all voices are representative of the Good Shepherd. We're talking about what Jesus meant with those famous words in John 10:10 that I am come that they might have life and have it abundantly or to the full. And we've got one more 10-minute segment of this conversation, which they'll pull together our thoughts and our study on this and talk about what we can expect to experience when we're living this life to the full that Jesus was talking about. And so we will wrap this up right after we take a look ahead to the next edition of the podcast. Next time, you'll share the table with the same group of friends, but Bill will be leading this study, one he's calling The Heart of the Church. And he'll take us to Acts chapter 2 to explore 4 things that those first followers of Jesus devoted themselves to that may give us some clues as to the kinds of things that may be healthy pursuits for us as followers of Jesus in 2025.
In my years as a pastor, I remember sitting in an awful lot of board meetings and leadership meetings and elder meetings and deacon meetings. And I don't know how much time we spent talking about these 4 things. Spent a lot of time talking about budgets and programs, and none of those things are bad. None of those things are unimportant. But these 4 elements in the life of the early church were the things that God used to do a significant work in the larger community. And I think that's worth looking at seriously as we think about our churches even today.
Yeah, our study is called The Heart of the Church. Next time on the Discover the Word podcast. All right, so let's listen now to how Elisa and Bill and Daniel and Rasul wrap up this episode in which we focused on John chapter 10 and Jesus' statement about how he came to bring life, abundant life, life to the full.
Y'all have heard of something defined as a scarcity mentality, right? What is it? And how does it affect us, how we live?
Yeah, it's when you always feel like you don't have enough. And so, you might have a meal, but it's missing something. So you notice the thing that you're missing, or you eat extra because you're worried you won't have more, even though you already do have more, or something like that. So it's kind of a perspective that you always don't have enough and you need more to be secure.
I think also there's an element to it of a scarcity mentality feels that if somebody else gets something, there's less available for me.
Yeah.
That's good, Bill.
Yeah, so I see it as there's a fear. It's a fear-based approach to reality in a life that says I have to grab it and hold on to it before it goes away. And sometimes that can be because of life experiences or history. But in general, like that is a particular way that governs actions, is a sense of fear of not having enough.
I think that what you're describing there, Rasul, is something that's really characteristic of children of the Depression. Children of the Depression grew up never having enough of anything. And as a result, many times they never threw anything away because you never know when you might need that. So you hang on to things. The lady who had an envelope, the label on it was strings too short to use. But a scarcity mentality will hold on to that.
Yeah.
So it comes from a loss, an experience of not having enough. Where else in our day and age, where do you see that the depression mentality is a great illustration, Bill? Where else do you see a scarcity mentality in our generations that we're living in right now?
Well, I think of people that have come through very difficult circumstances, whether it's through the foster care system or something like that, have experienced really intense hardships and have experienced not having enough many times in their life. And so it's a posture of not wanting to go back to that and the fear that it could any time because of those experiences.
Yeah, I remember my daughter when she graduated from college in 2021, like in the midst of the pandemic, there was an expectation really to find work that was suitable and that was a payoff. But I saw for her and a lot of her peers, there was really a sense of scarcity of those opportunities and a fear, am I going to find something? And so I think even something like those type of situations can impact how people see, is there enough or is there not enough?
And my mind also went to the pandemic, Rasul, and I had this picture in my mind of the empty toilet paper racks at the grocery store, where people would go to the grocery store day after day after day, and they would want to get 5 or 6 packets, but there was a limit of one. Yeah, that scarcity mentality, I think, really hit during COVID pretty hard.
That's a great illustration. Okay, if you think about what we're talking about here, how does the scarcity mentality impact our understanding of what Jesus says in John 10:10, I've come to give you life and life to the full? Where might Jesus's hearers have struggled with a scarcity mentality in the day Jesus actually spoke these words?
Well, Roman taxes were a tremendous burden put on every country that they conquered. And people who, as a general rule, did not have a lot of money anyway, felt that they were being pillaged constantly by the burden of taxes that just never seemed to end.
Yeah, and in this exact context, Jesus is talking to a small group of Pharisees, some of the Pharisees, who have challenged Jesus in verse 40 of chapter 9, surely we are not blind, are we? And there was a sense in which these stories show tension between Jesus's authority and his influence and the crowds that would follow him, and maybe a scarcity mentality of some of the religious leaders feeling like that threatens them because they have less influence or less people following them. So that could be another area where it shows up in this story.
Yeah, I think piggybacking off of both of those observations, I think in general, when you feel the type of marginalization that Israel of that time felt being a colony, where there is a lack that's imposed by someone who's extracting your wealth for their benefit, it can just feel like I got to go for self. I have to protect what I have. And so I think about that even, in the context of my studies in African American history and just seeing how it is difficult to embrace abundance when there is a sense of imposed lack. You know what I mean? Like I remember hearing my grandmother talk about how she wasn't able to get a house just because of the color of her skin. And it can cause a real sense of, I don't know, can God do it? Because it feels really hard right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to take that very painful reality and apply it in this story, understand, what's bubbling up here? How impossible the Pharisees were making it for anyone to get close to God. That's what I think too was happening, was this religious control that the Pharisees were enforcing on the community that made it impossible for them to even dream of having a full life, not just economically, but spiritually. And it's in this context that Jesus comes and says, I've come to give you life and life to the full. And he's talking about not just a roof over your head and, a couple more sheep. He's talking about a whole different experience of life, of a fullness, abundant life as its best. So let's read verse 9 down to verse 15. And let's listen for how he is removing the scarcity mentality and replacing it with a mentality of the abundance we can have in our good God. Daniel, would you start us and then just go around?
Mm-hmm. John 10, verse 9, I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it.
The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep.
This is Jesus saying, I'm sacrificing everything for you to have everything. How does that wipe away this more emotional result of the scarcity mentality? How does that help us have a way forward?
Well, I think we got to believe it for it to do that, because I'm sitting here thinking how easy it is for me to kind of see the first part. But the second part, it's like life to the full. It's like, okay, maybe one day or something I'll experience that. But there's a very real sense in which Jesus is saying, I'm offering this now, here, right? The kingdom is come now, is coming and has come. And Jesus is offering that. But I think my own mindset is typically to emphasize the first half, that he's come to bring life, but that I haven't really experienced the abundant life yet.
And can we?
Well, I think you have to, again, remember what it is we're talking about experiencing. I mean, I think historically, and even through our conversations on this subject, a lot of times living life to the full or a scarcity mentality or whatever is often linked to economics. But the spiritual reality of a fullness of life spiritually in our shepherd, that is available to us right now. That's not something that's postponed till heaven or whatever.
So there is a future element to it, and I just want to highlight way down in verse 27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life. So there is a both and here, that I can experience life to the full, which on this planet includes nice, wonderful things of smiling babies and full Thanksgiving tables, and deeply shattering things like cancer diagnoses and addictions, because I have this relationship with Jesus who lays down his life for me, and I trust him as my shepherd, and I recognize him and I follow him and I discern with him. Then I have what I need to live this life, hoping and moving and trusting in the life that he will give me in the future, because ain't nobody gonna snatch me out of his hand.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, amen. The relationship with this one who said he came so that we could have life to the full. The relationship with him is the key to experiencing it. Thanks, Elisa, for guiding the group through this look at John chapter 10 and the surrounding context as well, to help us understand and be able to process these important words of Jesus about life to the full. Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, Daniel Ryan Day, and Rasul Berry, your study partners for this edition of the Discover the Word podcast. Discover the Word is group Bible engagement from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And as a donor-funded nonprofit ministry, it is the generous support of listeners like you that makes it possible for us to fuel a global Bible engagement movement. You can give a one-time donation or become a monthly partner by visiting discovertheword.org and looking for the donate button that's up at the top of the page. Thanks. And thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word